Without further ado, we are going to be hearing from Melissa Farley, a feminist research and clinical psychologist who founded Prostitution Research and Education in 1995. She and the organization and their many partners are celebrating their 15th peer-reviewed publication on prostitution, trafficking, and pornography. Welcome, Melissa. Thank you very much for being here with us, and over to you.
I want to say that without the existence of Women's Declaration International and these Zoom seminars, I would not have been able to put these ideas together. Listening to the women on this series of webinars and feeling the courage of sisters from all over the world that makes it possible for me to put these things together and to talk about them out loud. So thank you. I'm going to talk about sexism, gender identity, and prostitution. Trans advocacy and sex work advocacy are political movements rooted in sexual objectification. And let me say that these slides are from an article that'll be published soon, I hope. And my email is in the chat if you want to request a copy of this. It's not going to be out for a while, but write me if you want a copy. The sex advocated by trans activists is declared to be inevitable, just like the sex advocated by sex work activists is also considered inevitable. The ideology of male supremacy undergirds both movements, and male supremacy determines how we understand the kinds of sex that must be considered necessary and uncontested. Sex as desired by the class that dominates women is held by that class to be elemental, urgent, necessary, even if, or even though it appears to require the repudiation of any claim women have to full human standing. Andrew Dworkin wrote that in the mid-'80s, and it was in Letters from a War Zone, a book that no US publisher would print. The first edition came out in the UK, and after its remarkable success, some US publishers crept back and put out another edition of it. People are confused about the difference between the word sex and the word gender. Some use the two words interchangeably, despite the fact that they have very different meanings. I've participated in several failed debates on sex and gender. For example, one person declared that the definitions of words in the dictionary did not apply to her use of words. How can we discuss sex and gender, I wondered, if we can't agree on the meaning of those words? The refusal to define words is a tactic that has frustrated many of us as we struggle to protect women's sex-based rights, as they're dangerously eroded by the social and legal replacement of the word sex by the word gender. Idiosyncratic and woke language used by pimps and postmodernists block communication of theory and evidence regarding prostitution. Just as the words sex and gender have been blurred, so also the words prostitution and trafficking have often been deliberately blurred. There's disagreement regarding what exactly trafficking is because its definition varies so widely. The word pimping, on the other hand, is understood and opposed by most people. There are ideological parallels between the political movement promoting gender identity or trans rights and the political movement promoting prostitution as sex work. While both claim the lofty goal of freeing people from discrimination, the foundation of both movements is sexual objectification. And sexual objectification is the opposite of any kind of freedom. Gender identity exists because of sexual objectification. Socially defined femininity and masculinity are rooted in sexual objectification. When sexually objectified, a girl or a woman is defined by her sexual characteristics and made into a thing for others' sexual use. Sexual objectification enables an abuser to view another person as an object through a process of fragmentation and exploitation. Sexual objectification is at the root of sexual violence because objects have no feelings, even if great harm is perpetrated against them. Women are objectified via pimps' transformation of them into profitable commodities. Women and girls of color are doubly objectified on the basis of both racism and sexism. Sex work activists, like trans activists, promote a sexually objectified performance of femininity. Advocates of gender ideology normalize the sex trade because prostitution validates their view of women as sex objects. Furthermore, prostitution allows trans women, that is, men who self-identify as women, and trans men, women who self-identify as men, to pay for hormones and surgeries. Gender identity advocates ignore the harms of sexual objectification. Instead, men who identify as women seek out and desire sexual objectification, considering it to be proof that they're women. Over time, sexual objectification and commodification are internalized. This takes a toll on self-esteem. A woman in strip club prostitution explained this eloquently. You start changing yourself to fit a fantasy role of what they think a woman should be. In the real world, these women don't exist. She's talking about men in a strip club, they stare at you with this starving hunger. It sucks you dry. You become this empty shell. They're not really looking at you. You're not you. You're not even there. Self-objectification causes people to value their physical appearance more than they value their body's ability to function in the world. The results are self-surveillance, body shame, and the belief that you control how you look if you try hard enough. Daniels and Zurbriggen and a couple of other psychologists have been researching these adverse psychological effects of self-objectification for years. The harmful effects of self-objectification go even deeper when disconnection and dissociation are encouraged by sex work and trans activists. Disembodiment, dissociation, and psychological fragmentation are common in prostitution and also common when women and men are encouraged to act on the feeling that they were born in the wrong body. The dissociation necessary to survive prostitution also occurs among people who assert that they have transed or changed their sex. Extreme body disconnectedness and somatic dissociation are valorized by social media. This has resulted in some horrific cases of body mutilation, such as that of a woman who had a fake penis made out of skin sliced from her thigh, and her photo was put on the cover of New York Magazine in the last couple years. Although similarities exist, the social and psychological factors affecting Men who identify as women are quite different from the factors affecting women who identify as men. Women's discomfort with gender roles peaks at adolescence when, as Vaishnavi Sundar put it, women flee womanhood as it's culturally defined. A lesbian blogger wrote that her body dysphoria was accompanied by dissociative symptoms. At adolescence, as men began to leer at her, she felt vulnerable, objectified, exposed, and frightened. She blamed herself and her developing body for these threats from men in a sexist culture. She dissociated. That is, she psychologically disconnected herself from the part of herself that men visually assaulted her breasts. And she wrote, "If I think about my breasts long enough, I feel like they are not mine. They are not me. They hurt me. They stop me doing things I want to. Obsession, dissociation, dysphoria can create the sensation that my body is not an integrated whole, but a collection of parts, as if I could detach the bits I don't like, as if my breasts were somehow not me, but stuck on the front of me. I want them away. I want to switch them out for something else. It's as if I was a robot, not a human." It's a short step from that feeling to hormones and surgeries. Men who self-identify as women often use women in pornography as their role models. Trans porn is popular on pornography search engines. Multinational corporations such as MindGeek's Pornhub are capitalizing on trans porn's popularity by increasing productions and investments in trans porn. Genevieve Gluck has described the pornography-induced dysphoria that promotes extreme sexual objectification and the degradation of women via sissy porn or forced feminization porn. Men are forced to become women via wearing lingerie, makeup, sexual humiliation, and subordination by more dominant men in rituals that are akin to fraternity hazing rituals or boot camp humiliation. Rape and rape culture are celebrated by these men who self-identify as women. If, as Judith Herman said, rape is the signal crime of male supremacy, then trans women's, that is men who self-ID as women, fetishization of rape is the idealization of male supremacy. And of course, the ubiquity of rape in prostitution is ignored or erased. Political activism merges sex work is work with trans women are women. Gender identity activists promote decriminalized prostitution as an element of trans rights. A Brazilian man who self-identified as a woman was commended as a human rights activist despite a previous conviction for pimping. Academic activist Sophie Pezzuto is affiliated both with the Sex Worker Outreach Project, SWAP, and a gender agenda. Defining prostitution as a reasonable job for men who self-identify as women, trans activists assume that prostitution is a reasonable option for them. Even if men in prostitution who identify as trans women tell us that, like women, they also prefer escape from prostitution. The political viewpoints of donors influence nonprofit organizations, universities, and governments. The gender identity movement and the sex work movement are supported by Bill Gates, who's worth $51 billion, and George Soros. Rich donors have a powerful impact on the public's understanding of prostitution and gender identity. Gates, in particular, has a grotesquely oversized influence on media reporting in the fields of public health, prostitution, and gender identity. Gates has donated millions to major media outlets, including NPR, PBS, ABC, BBC, Al Jazeera, The Daily Telegraph, The Financial Times, Univision, and The Guardian. The London Guardian was further incentivized by a $250,000 donation from the Soros Open Society Foundation to cover gender identity in news coverage that is, quote, favorable, quotable, and easily understood. Here's a new media spin in 2021. Gender identity is now folded into gender equality. The three largest foundations in the world, Gates, Soros, and Ford, have committed a total of $2.620 billion to advancing, quote, gender identity and gender equality. So if you wonder why we have a hard time getting our theory and messages and evidence out, that's why. And here's another reason why. Gaslighting and DARVO. As Andrea Nobre said on this seminar a couple months ago, we can't fight sexism unless we can see sex. Why do intelligent people abandon logic and declare themselves committed to fictions? An understanding of gaslighting and DARVO in the trans advocacy and sex work advocacy movements might help explain this phenomenon. It also might help some of us feel a little less crazy as we deal with our friends, family, political allies, and politicians. Sex trade pimps and sex buyers use gaslighting to defend prostitution. Sure, she's exploited, but she earns really good money, doesn't she? In this example, the gaslighter minimizes the harms of prostitution by describing being raped and assaulted as exploited, and they misinform and confuse and silence the listener by suggesting that the payment of money diminishes the cruelty of prostitution. The tautological slogans, sex work is work and trans women are women, are examples of gaslighting. A UK video from Celebrity Big Brother shows a man who self-identifies as a woman angrily demanding that a woman repeat after him, trans women are real women. Trans women are real women. The lie that a man can turn into a woman is insistently repeated like brainwashing. The compliant listener in the video repeats the lie despite its irrationality. In an example of gender identity policy gaslighting, police in Scotland were instructed to log rapes as being perpetrated by a woman if the accused person insists he is a woman. In other words, if a sex offender with a penis says he's a woman, and if he's placed in a woman's jail, and if he rapes a woman in the jail, then the rape is logged as having been committed by a woman. In this way, the crime of rape is socially and statistically disappeared via record-keeping gaslighting. The result is that data about rape, a critical indicator of male violence against women, is fatally weakened. Referring to this absurdity in a way that reverses the mindfuck, J.K. Rowling tweeted, "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. The penis individual who raped you is a woman." And thank you to Wolf for your recent lawsuits and your successes in challenging the state of California, who's putting large numbers of men who self-identify as women into women's jails, which is endangering them. And I'm aware this is happening all over the world. DARVO is a particularly nasty variant of gaslighting. It's a reaction by abusers in response to being held accountable for their behavior. The abuser may deny the behavior, explained Jennifer Fried, who started this theory, then attack the individual doing the confronting, then reverse the role of victim and offender so that the abuser assumes the victim role and turns the true victim or whistleblower into an alleged abuser. Both the targeted victim and bystanders can be stunned into confusion, apprehension, and silence. The cognitive distortions created by a DARVO abuser can cause entire cultures to become callous about the harms and betrayal of victimized groups. Sex work advocates manipulate people's perception by denying pimps and sex buyers violence. Instead, sex work activists accuse those of us who seek sex buyer accountability of making their lives more dangerous by arresting the abusers. Prostitution abolitionists, not sex buyers, are named as victimizers. Feminists who propose limits to men's rights to identify as women at the point where women's rights are jeopardized are accused of transphobia or even violence against trans women. In a DARVO climate, no amount of evidence is enough to prove the abuser's transgressions. Denial of the reality of sex by gender identity advocates is a DARVO maneuver that begins with science denialism and ends with vicious scapegoating of feminists who are gender identity skeptics. DARVO is harmful to the victim in that it traps her into feeling like she is the problem. Our liberal sisters who call themselves cis women or who use pronouns have been trapped by gender ideologists' DARVO maneuvers. Feminist opposition to the political movement for gender identity is aimed at protecting women's right to exist in society and in law. Once we understand the destructive nature of prostitution, feminists oppose prostitution because we support women's right to exist without prostitution in society and under the law. If we agree that women have the right to avoid sex-based stereotyping and subordination, then let's add a few words to the WDI Declaration. Let's reaffirm women's right to live a life free from the exploitation of trafficking, prostitution, and pornography. Let's support the CEDAW articles that advocate for women's sex-based rights and our right not to be objectified and commodified. The danger of changing one law while compromising other laws that protect women's sex-based rights was illustrated in the US state of Wyoming when gender identity activists attempted to repeal a law that prohibited female genital mutilation, FGM. The law in Wyoming existed in order to protect women immigrants from FGM. It was a great law. Ironically, gender identity activists sought to repeal Wyoming's law prohibiting FGM because they felt the law would interfere with men's rights to their own genital mutilation, called bottom surgery. Fortunately, the Wyoming repeal attempt failed, and the law protecting women from FGM remains in effect. But in other instances, laws protecting women have been repealed or laws have been proposed that would remove women's sex-based protections. The Equality Amendment proposal would remove women's sex-based protection by classifying gender identity as a subtype of sex. This legal proposal puts forth ideas that sound reasonable but fail to protect women. Sex in this proposal becomes a recycling container where any person who says, "I feel like a woman," is declared to be legally the same as an adult human female. And this is some words from the Equality Amendment proposal. Pregnancy, gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity are grouped under sex because they're all facets of the unified but diverse system of inequality that privileges maleness and masculinity over femaleness and femininity. Can't argue with that. It certainly does privilege maleness and masculinity, but the solution is not to erase the category of women and adult human females. If anyone can legally declare himself to be a woman because he feels feminine, then women are legally eradicated, as Karadansky has pointed out in her recent book. An event happened in 2019 that deeply affected my understanding of sexism, violence, and the gender identity movement. I was sitting with a woman at a San Francisco playground. Her 11-year-old daughter ran to her mom crying. A boy at the playground had gotten mad at the girl and called her a trans bitch. The mother comforted her daughter and then stormed over to the boy's caregiver. 10 minutes later, she returned looking satisfied. "What did you say?" I asked. The mother proudly described how she educated the caregiver about transphobia and how, quote, "At our school, we don't think trans people are bad. We welcome them and we're not prejudiced against trans people, so we don't use that word as an insult against them." After a pause, I asked, "Did you say anything to him about his son calling your daughter a bitch?" She stared blankly at me. No, she had not mentioned his use of that word. Sitting there, my heart sank. She voiced concern only about the well-being of people who are born male but feel like they're female. Yet the word used all over the world to insult and degrade women and justify violence against women was not a concern for her. The boy's sexist epithet was not seen or challenged. The Facebook group Planting Peace wrote about an invasive slice of the pie. And they wrote, these are their words, "This should be easy to understand how freedoms work. This person took his part, but it affected others negatively. He exercised his freedom, but with an injustice to others. Freedom can't be exercised just as every individual wants without looking at injustices to others. Justice disappears when you harm others." The pie slice is an example of bad exercise of individual freedom. So a longstanding feminist movement to abolish gender is complementary to the movement to abolish prostitution. Both political movements reject the sexual objectification that is at the heart of prostitution and gender identity. Thus, gender abolitionism and prostitution abolitionism go hand in hand.
Could Melissa please reiterate the specific statistics she shared about the money to the media and the sources? Women need this info to push back against people who get mad at us for using conservative media.
I would recommend for those of us who are political activists that we track. You see where that's from, Kara? The Philanthropy News Digest. It's you can subscribe to that. Any nonprofit can subscribe to that. And that's where that information came from. We look at it to see if there's some big donor that is going to provide funding for some trafficking or prostitution research that we're going to do. And boom, this came up when I was scrolling through it. And given the rate of funding of these issues, gender identity, gender equality, as they call it, God knows what they mean by those words, but they're never clear, of course. But there was a report from the Philanthropy News Digest, the 3 largest foundations in the world, Gates, Soros, and the Ford Foundation, have jointly committed $2.620 billion for the promotion of gender identity, gender equality. And if you want the specific URL of that, please email me and I will give that to you so you can cite it. The good news is there were some devastating critiques from watchdog groups in the US of the outsized influence of what money can buy in the way of governments. In the case of the United States, money buys a large portion of our government and government policy. This is corporatism at its ominous, lethal worst. People like Gates, for example, has for decades driven public health policy. Just recently in Sweden, the entire public health department of Karolinska University, we found out later, Karolinska's public health department is entirely funded by Gates. So guess what happened when we approached them about funding a study on the adverse effects of pornography and prostitution on Swedish women's lives? Hello, it's been nice meeting you, goodbye, you know, with a few hours conversation in between. Make no mistake about it. It's not just the messaging to journals, it's the research that's the foundation of so-called science, right? The whole construction of reality, starting with the science, is controlled by corporate interests. And anybody who has an academic position knows this, knows how the funding drives all kinds of support in academia. And if you say the wrong thing, like these amazing women, like Raquel Rosario Sanchez or some other women in the UK, pardon me for not saying everyone's name, but Raquel's fight from a one-down position as a graduate student was nothing short of heroic. And it's not over yet, but that's what money does, in my opinion. So thank you for the question, and write me if you want more details on the sources.